Welcome to day 3. And today, now that we know all about how light gets turned into an image with what a sensor does, it's now time to talk about how that light becomes focused into something that the sensor can recognize in the first place. And it does so by the lenses that you have on your cameras. So let's start with the mechanical basics of lenses. What exactly are they, and what is inside them that makes them actually work? Lenses work through a process called refraction. Modern camera lenses are comprised of a series of concave and convex optical elements, and when light passes through each one of those elements, it bends and refracts the incoming light until it reaches a single sharp focal point and then it terminates at the camera sensor. The camera sensor then, turns that into a digital image that we're all familiar with and we spent last lesson learning about. Each lens will have a focal length. This focal length is how we refer to the amount of magnification a particular lens has. Now, our human eyes, see at around 50 millimeters or so in focal length. So focal lengths that are considered like 16 or 24 are called wide focal lengths, as in wider than our normal human field of view. And then focal lengths such as like 100 or 200 like this are called telephoto focal lengths. Tele meaning over a great distance in Greek, also referring to the very narrow field of view and perspective that it gives. Now, to talk about lenses, we need to talk about aperture. And we will cover aperture way more in depth in the exposure lesson in just a few days. But for now, we need a basic understanding of how aperture and its related concepts work so that I can explain the types of lenses there are and which to buy and which to give you recommendations on. Inside all lenses, usually towards the front, they have what's called an aperture. The aperture of a lens is basically a series of blades that are like fanned on top of one another to create a smaller or wider hole for the light to get through. This is kind of how like the iris in your eye works. When you're in a dark room, the iris of your eye automatically dilates and gets bigger so that your eye can then let in more light so that you can see more in the dark. And then when you come out of that dark room and turn on the light, right, there's a lot more ambient light around. And so your eye needs way less light and it needs to adjust so that it doesn't let in as much light as well. So that you can then balance the exposure so that you can walk around the room. And so then the iris actually contracts and becomes smaller. And it does that the same way in that lenses do as well. And that's how the aperture blades in a lens work as well. In lenses, the aperture has a relationship between the diameter of the opening divided by the focal length of that lens. Now, the science doesn't really matter at this stage, but what is important is that we call this particular measurement f-stops. Commonly, you will see f-stops such as f1.4, f2.8, f4, etc. on their own as individual numbers, or you will see them in a range such as like f4.5 to f5.6. And either way, the number represents the maximum capability of the aperture in that lens. It refers to the maximum amount of opening to that lens. But it does get a little bit confusing in the sense that the lower the number or the closer to zero that number, the larger the aperture it is. So f1.4 makes a larger hole than f4. And, for some people, this can be confusing, but that's just how it is in photography. And it's just something you just have to commit to memory via route memorization, unfortunately. In theory, a larger aperture allows for more light to pass through that lens. And as we know, photography is all about light, and sometimes letting in a lot of light come through is a good thing. But other times, it might not be. And again, we'll go into a deeper dive into the practical applications of aperture in the days to come because it's really, really important to understand the basics of how exposure works in photography, and aperture is one of the 3 ways in which to do that. But today's lesson is all about lenses, and we needed to learn all of that f-stop stuff because when it comes to making a purchase decision, the f-stop of a lens can be a really big determiner of that lens quality, size, weight, and price. So there are two main kinds of lenses, zoom lenses and prime lenses. Zoom lenses offer a range of focal lengths to work with, as you probably might have assumed from the name. And some common zoom ranges are 1635, 2470, and 7200, like these three lenses here. Now, the ability to have a wide range of focal lengths to work with in a single lens gives us extreme versatility when shooting, allowing us to pick and choose the right length for the right job at the right time and not having to change lenses so often to do so. But the downside is that zoom lenses are typically bigger and heavier because they contain more optical elements inside to be able to do all of that complex zooming. Now, because they have all of those extra optical elements, they can also be a little bit more fragile with their moving parts. But furthermore, because of that complexity, you'll find that even at the very top tier end of the spectrum when it comes to zooms, they also don't have as bigger apertures as their prime lens counterparts. And speaking of prime lenses are lenses that only have one single focal length. These lenses are stuck on one length, which means that if you need to change your composition, instead of zooming in and out on the lens itself, you need to zoom with your feet, as they say, and physically move back and forth. Primes, compared to zooms, are usually simpler in optical design, and so they have less elements in them, which usually means that they are smaller and lighter and usually have much larger apertures and therefore much larger f-stops as well. Now, in the past, at least at the higher, more expensive end of the spectrum, it used to be the case that primes were also much sharper than zooms as well. But especially in the era of modern lenses nowadays, the difference between the sharpness isn't as drastic as it once was. Alrighty, time to get technical again. So, regardless of whether a lens is a zoom lens or a prime lens, every single lens has what's called a minimum focusing distance as well as a magnification ratio. The minimum focusing distance of a lens is the closest point you can get your subject to a lens while still remaining in focus. It's the same theory as like if you were to put a finger in front of your face, you'll find that you can focus on every single thing up until around probably 10 centimeters away from your face, and then everything closer to that is out of focus. And it's the same deal with lenses as well. You know, every single lens that you own should have a minimum focusing distance written on the front of the lens somewhere. It will start with an icon that looks like this, and then it will say the measurement. The icon here is to signify that this measurement starts from the start of the sensor. So your camera body will also have this icon as well. So in this case, for this lens, it's 0.85 meters from this point in this camera. That's the closest distance that this lens can focus. Now, this is important to know because anything before this point will never be in focus, despite what you try and do, right? And some lenses have a closer minimum focusing distance than others. And sometimes it pays to know where this point is, because if you're shooting too close and you don't know why it's out of focus, then it might just be because you're too close. It might not actually be any other settings aside from the fact that you're just too close. Now, a lens has a magnification ratio as well. The magnification ratio is how much reproduction magnification the lens provides relative to its focal length and its real world size. Let me explain that. So, for example, if I'm taking a photo of an ant, and my lens has a reproduction value of 1 to 2, and the ant is 1 centimeter in real life. If I'm taking a photo of that ant at this minimum focusing distance, super close, right? Then in my image, the ant will be half a centimeter because 1 to 2 ratio is half. If the magnification is 1 to 3, then the ant will be a third of the real world size, or 0.33 centimeters in this case. 1 to 4 will be a quarter, and so on. Now, why this is important is that every lens has its own magnification ratio. And when we're taking photos of things up close, like in macro photography, for example, this is where it matters. The 85mm lens that I keep using as an example has a magnification ratio of 1 to 8.3. So even at its minimum focusing distance, things aren't really ever that big. However, with macro lenses, such as the 90mm macro lens by Sony, They have a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning that the things that you shoot appear in real world size, so they're 1-to-1. So they're super big by comparison. Now, this is an example of where gear purchases you make can really have an effect on the types of photography you do or the types of photography you're enabled to do as well. And in this case, a macro lens enables you to do macro photography. Surprise, surprise. Now, as another tangential example, a prime lens with a big aperture or a low f-stop number, such as f1.4, might allow you to do more night photography in lower light conditions, for example. For most applications, magnification ratio isn't as important as minimum focusing distance. However, we still want to keep a mental note on the minimum focusing distance of our lenses because that's where things like shallow depth of field or bokeh come into play, which we will talk about a little bit more in day 9. Alrighty, super technical, I know. I hope you are following along okay. Now, let's talk about which lenses to buy. So, manufacturers have a system, but they don't really make it all that easy to understand when it comes to buying a lens because, of course, they don't, right? Now, generally speaking, the lower the aperture number a lens is, the more expensive it's going to be, and usually the higher quality it is. But in the world of zooms versus primes, they each have their own separate numbers and separate categories. So let's dive into that. Let's do zooms first. So zooms from most manufacturers generally have 3 levels: variable, f4, and f2.8. So variable lenses are the ones that will have a higher f-stop number that will change as the zoom changes. So for example, this kit lens here is a 28 to 80 millimeter lens that has a variable aperture of f4 to f5.6. Now what that means is that at the 28 millimeter length of this lens, the biggest aperture you can have is going to be f4. However, as you start to zoom the lens, even without changing the aperture yourself, the aperture will eventually change to 5.6. Now, where this change happens as it zooms is different for every single lens, but this is important to know, right? The values listed for these lenses refer to the largest aperture that lens can open up to its minimum and maximum focal lengths, not the entire range of the aperture, right? For reference, the maximum aperture of this lens can go all the way up to f22, regardless of whether you start at f4 or f5.6. With variable lenses, these are typically the easiest to manufacture. They're typically the smallest and the lightest lenses, and they're typically the cheapest as well. But that being said, they're typically not the sharpest, and they typically come with the smallest apertures, the smallest minimum apertures, and they usually have a cheapish, plasticky build quality. But there are definitely bargains to be had. There are some variable lenses that are better than others. F4 lenses are where things start to get really interesting when it comes to zooms. So these lenses are known as constant aperture lenses because regardless of the focal length you use, they will always have a minimum aperture of, let's say, f4. So regardless of whether you're using a 1635, 2470, or 7200, or any other zoom lens, if you see that it just has a single number, just the number f4 or even f2.8, you know that the minimum aperture of that lens will be that regardless of what focal length you use it. It'll be the same regardless of how much you zoom into it. Now, the f4s are interesting because they represent a good balance of performance and price. They are the mid-tier and they're enthusiast grade. And they typically have decent image quality and decent image sharpness. And sometimes if you get lucky, they might even have things like weather resistance. And the builds tend to move from like plastic to a more durable metal. And these lenses will be heavier and bulkier and more expensive than, the variable counterparts. But there will also be lighter and smaller and cheaper compared to the f2.8 counterparts. The f2.8 lenses, though, these guys are where things get premium. Typically, f2.8 series of lenses are for pros and enthusiasts. They typically offer the highest amount of image quality and sharpness for any zoom, and they're usually the biggest and the heaviest and the most expensive lenses in the entire line of lenses from that manufacturer, typically. All right, side note, you've heard me mention 3 very specific focal ranges when I've been talking about zoom lenses. these three, the 1635, 2470, and 7200. And that's because these three zoom ranges are known as the holy trinity of zoom lenses. And most manufacturers have some version of these lenses in both f2.8 versions and f4 versions. These lenses are such a fantastic place to start as a beginner, and I'd highly recommend that you grab one of these lenses as your first purchase. Definitely an f4 version at least to start, but if you've got the cash, then an f2.8 version means that you won't have to upgrade again. Now, I recommend these lenses in these ranges specifically because they cover you all the way from 16 all the way up to 200 millimeters. And with this entire range, you can do absolutely every single genre of photography. And you can start to learn which focal lengths you like the most, as well as understanding which genre of photography you like the most as well. Now, many photographers tend to find that they like specific focal lengths and specific ranges for specific genres of photography, no surprise. And having access to all of these ranges is a fantastic way to find out what works for you and, what you would eventually gravitate towards in your journey on photography. And once you find these focal lengths, then you might want to consider getting a prime lens in that focal length too. So let's talk about that. Now, prime lenses are a whole other kettle of fish. However, much like zoom lenses have variable f4 and f2.8 classes, prime lenses have the equivalent f1.4 or lower, f1.8 and f2.8 classes. Much like zooms, sure, you'll find some variations in some of those classes here and there, such as like f1.2s and f2s and other weird numbers like that, but the base idea is the same. There are three general categories of prime lenses. With primes, what you're paying for when you are going up and down classes is generally how big the minimum aperture can be, or how low the f-stop number goes, or in what we in photography lingo call speed. Now, speed or fast lenses get their name because the bigger the aperture the lens allows you to have, the more light you can let into the lens, right? And with more light comes the ability to speed up your shutter speed, which is crucial for some genres of photography, such as portraits and sport and street photography and more. Now, we'll learn much more about this relationship between aperture and shutter speed when we talk about exposure in coming days. But for now, know that if I mention the word or the idea of speed when I'm talking about lenses and I'm saying fast lenses, I'm referring to lenses like f1.2, f1.4, f1.8, and large aperture sizes like that. The first class of prime lenses we'll introduce are the slowest of the bunch at f2.8 or more. So remember that this is the same speed as the top end zoom lenses. However, in this case with a prime, you don't have the flexibility of zooming, so you still have to zoom with your feet, right? Now, some of the biggest benefits of these prime lenses at f2.8 are typically that they are physically very small compared to their zoom counterparts. And, sometimes when you're traveling or you need to be light, this might be what you want, especially if you know that you love a particular focal length, for example. My very first prime was the 35mm f2.8, and I loved that thing because it was absolutely tiny. It was what they refer to as a pancake lens, and it was sharp as hell and relatively cheap as well. And I personally love the 35mm focal length. It's one for me that I can do many genres of photography with, so it's a prime that I'm always keeping in my kit. For me today, I own a f1.4 version of this lens over here on that shelf because I just enjoy faster primes. Speaking of which, the next category of primes is f1.8. So f1.8 lenses are a big step up in terms of quality from the f2.8 category of primes. They're typically not that much bigger than the f2.8 siblings, but they do offer a much shallower depth of field, or what's commonly known as bokeh, that creamy background blur and separation. And we will talk again more about this on day 9 when we talk about depth of field. Now, because we're going up in tier again, these f1.8 prime lenses may be slightly bigger, slightly heavier and a little bit more expensive than their f2.8 counterparts, but you will get better image quality and sharpness and better build quality overall. So as always, the price balance is completely up to you. Again, this is the mid-tier, and it's typically great for enthusiasts or pros who want something just a little bit lighter than the next tier up, which are the f1.4 primes. And speaking of f1.4 primes, these primes are the highest tier of prime lenses. These are typically the best of the best in terms of image sharpness and image quality. They usually have features like, weather sealing and flare resistance and adjustable rings and buttons and other pro features and stuff like that. But they definitely have the price to match. And while they won't be as expensive as their f2.8 top tier counterparts, they're definitely not cheap. Now, this is the tier that pros and cashed up enthusiasts go for. And unless you really know which focal length you absolutely love using, I wouldn't recommend getting one of these as a very first starting lens. But hey, it's your money and you do what you like. Alrighty, I know this has been a lot so far, but I wanted to add this little side note about lens quality if you really want to get into the weeds about the difference between the tiers of quality when it comes to lenses. Now, what you're looking for when it comes to quality are generally three things: image sharpness, autofocus performance, and vignetting. Sure, there are many more things to look out for, as I'm sure some people will point out, but the other things are generally a little bit more advanced and definitely wander into the realm of diminishing returns, so we'll stick to the main three factors here. The first one is sharpness, and sharpness is about, well, sharpness, but specifically what we're referring to is resolving power is what it's called. Resolving power is typically measured in equivalent megapixels, and it's about the idea that a lens can go on a wide variety of different camera bodies, but not every camera body has a lot of megapixels. So a lens that doesn't resolve as many megapixels might look okay on a camera body that doesn't, have a lot of megapixels as well. But using the same lens on a camera body that does have a lot of megapixels might result in an image that looks muddy or not very sharp. And there are many lenses out there that punch well above their weight class. And, while there isn't currently a commercial way to measure how good the resolving power of a lens is, you can see it for yourself if you take a picture of the same thing with different lenses while trying to keep the frame similar. I will add that the lower tier lenses like the f2.8 primes or the variable zooms will have a propensity to have a little bit less resolving power than, their more expensive counterparts. Now, when it comes to focusing, which we'll talk a lot more about in later days to come, the majority of the work is actually done within the lens itself. Now, usually we refer to lenses as being fast or slow focusing, and obviously you want fast focusing for most intents and purposes. Now, there are many different technologies being used in all different kinds of lenses from all different kinds of manufacturers, but to prevent me from getting way too technical at this point in time, know that when you are out there shopping for lenses, a huge factor to overall lens quality is whether the lens actually focuses quickly or not. That's like a great thing you can ask the person at the shop, for example, right? So when you're researching for lenses, keep this in mind. Does this lens focus well and quickly? And do all the reviews say that it does? And vignetting is a phenomenon where the sides of the frame become a little bit darker than the center of the frame. And all lenses have some kind of vignetting, whether you can see it or not. And in photography, it's often corrected in post-production or in camera anyway, so it's not a huge deal, but it's definitely something you want to consider if you want to decide to get into video, for example, as in video, it can't be as easily corrected. Now, there's no real rhyme or reason when it comes to which lenses have vignetting and which don't, nor which ones have more and which ones have less. It's just something you have to be aware of when you're out buying lenses. And a great way to test for this is just to take a picture of a blank white wall, and you'll be easily able to see what I mean when it comes to the amount of vignette. Now, there are other factors when you are judging lens performance, things like transmission and chromatic aberration and distortion performance and so much more. But, those things, they can matter, but they are the 5% of performance that really at this stage of the game, at the beginning of your photography game, they're not important. But you are more than welcome to dive into those topics, which is why I did mention them. But again, anything after those three things that we covered before, sharpness, autofocus, performance, and vignetting, anything after that is diminishing returns in my opinion. And there are so many other more amazing and fun things to learn in photography. Now, another way you can approach which lens to buy is if you know which genres of photography you see yourself doing a lot of at this point in time. Now, keep in mind, and this is very important, you can make most lenses work with most genres of photography. However, there are specialty use cases for specific genres of photography that I'll cover here, and that might give you a great place to get started if you have something already in mind. Now, if you are planning to do street photography, then I would recommend starting with a 24-70 or a 7200 zoom lens. This is so that you can start shooting from a distance and ease your way into the category. You can practice far away at first, and then as you get, better and better, things get more confrontational and closer, and you can move closer to your subjects as you get better. Primes wise, I've found that, I've had great success in 35 millimeters, although that's definitely pretty advanced in my opinion, but 85 to start with. 85 millimeters is a great place to start for street, in my opinion. If you are doing landscape photography, versatility is your best friend. I would recommend starting with a 1635 or a 7200, and this will enable you to take pictures of big, wide open vistas or punch in on the details for photographs where you want to take landscapes that are really far away. All right? And to start with, primes for landscapes aren't that big of a deal, and you're often using a tripod, and so your depth of field is going to be wide, so you don't really need that fast of a lens. However, as you get more nuanced into the styles of landscape photography that you can do, like astrophotography, for example, then it's there that you find specific primes to do specific types of shots. Like a 14 millimeter f1.8, for example, is like the perfect astrophotography lens. For portrait photography, straight out the gate, I'd recommend a 24-70. Now, this is a great range to start with to understand what kinds of portraits you'd like to do the most, because there are so many different types of portraits. You can go wide for contextual portraits, or you can go more telephoto end for intimate images, right? Once you start to understand the look that you're trying to go for, then getting a fast prime in that focal length that you love is a great idea to start then increasing the amount of bokeh, or the background separation that you get in your images. While 85 millimeters might be, the portrait photographer's best friend for many people, I'm personally a huge fan of 24 millimeters and 35 millimeter portraits as well. But you can make portraits work with any focal length, even like weird ones like 14 or even like 200, although the 200 might not be as practical as you think it might be. But most of the time, photographers will stay in the range of about 24 to 105-ish. What about architecture? Well, for architecture photography and the many subgenres of it, like interiors, real estate, etc., they're a great place to go super duper wide. Literally as wide as you can get. There are fantastic 12 to 24 zoom lenses out there that are a fantastic place to start. With architecture, you usually want a lot of depth of field, so unless you're shooting in a really dark interiors without a tripod, most of the time there isn't that much need for a prime lens unless you have a very specific look you're going for, or unless you want to splurge out on like a 14 millimeter f1.8. What about sports and wildlife? Well, these categories, you are usually pretty far away from your subject, and your subjects are always changing and moving. So generally, a lot of photographers in these genres use 7200s like this one, or even the 100-400 quite often. And with these focal lengths, you need, if you need more reach, then most manufacturers have a 1.4 or 2 times extender for them as well. So you can get even more zoom for the same lens, which is super handy. And in these genres, you'll often see the pros use gigantic 400mm f2.8 lenses, which are absolutely insane and cost like $10,000 to $20,000 each, and they're the size of like my arm. They're gigantic, and unless you're making serious bank off this particular purchase, then something like a 7200 or 100-400 will do for now to at least get your feet wet. All right, that's it for today's lesson on lenses. Let's dive into the assignment. So today's assignment is a continuation from yesterday's future planning. And yesterday we discovered which manufacturer we are going to go with. We planned out what cameras we want to get and what we consider to be our eventual end game, hopefully. For today, I want you to take a good guess at what kind of genre or use case really speaks to you the most from today's lesson. And I want you to add those lenses to your upgrade path. I'd like you to answer the question of what lenses do you own now? What lenses do you want to own in the near future when you're exploring more photography genres and styles? And then at the end game, what does your entire kit of lenses look like and which lenses would be there? Again, diving into all of this research will enlighten you about how manufacturers sell lenses and camera bodies and why, as well as understanding all of the little bits of, domain knowledge required for gear purchasing, because there's a lot of it. But with an end goal in mind that you adjust along the way, you will be well equipped to make smarter purchase decisions down the road and save yourself a bunch of money in the process. All right. See you tomorrow.